So, diving into social justice movements, huh? That's awesome. I bet you're finding it's a bit more complicated than it might seem at first glance.
Yeah, it definitely is. People often imagine these movements as like one big united front, but it's important to remember they're made up of individuals, right? And people are, well, complicated.
Exactly. We're all complex, and that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. We're looking at an article by Christian Ortiz, Homophobia in Civil Rights Movements, the Exclusion of LGBTQ plus leaders, the Forgotten Half of Justice, how misogyny and racial activism undermines true liberation. And we're going to see how these internal tensions, sometimes within the movements themselves, played out.
It's really about examining these movements with a critical eye. Not to tear them down, of course, but to understand where they fell short and why.
Right. Learn from the past. So let's kick things off with a story that really gets at this tension. Ever heard of Bayard Rustin?
Oh, absolutely. Rustin's a fascinating figure, a brilliant strategist, really. Sadly, not as well known as he should be.
I know, right? He was a close advisor to Martin Luther King Jr. and even organized the 1963 March on Washington. But here's the thing. He was often pushed aside, shunned even, and it was all because he was a gay man.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of what Ortiz calls respectability politics, where marginalized groups try to fit in with mainstream society's norms to gain acceptance, even if those norms end up hurting some members of their own group.
So in the civil rights movement, some leaders worried that having a gay man in a prominent position would hurt their image, make it harder to get support from white America.
Right, and that fear, but you can see where it was coming from, led to someone as brilliant and dedicated as Rustin being sidelined. Imagine fighting racism in society, homophobia within his own movement. Talk about a double burden.
Makes you wonder how many other voices, how many contributions were lost or minimized because of these internal biases, huh?
Absolutely. And it wasn't just limited to the civil rights movement. Ortiz also looks at the Chicano movement of the 1960s and 70s. They were fighting for the rights of Mexican Americans, but the movement was heavily influenced by machismo. You heard that term before.
Machismo, yeah. I know it has something to do with masculinity, but I'm not sure I fully understand it.
Well, think of it as a very strong emphasis on traditional masculine traits, like strength, not showing emotions, being in charge. And while it can be part of cultural pride, it can also lead to other identities and experiences being suppressed.
I see. So how did this machismo actually play out within the Chicano movement?
Well, often women and LGBTQ plus individuals got pushed to the margins. Their voices weren't heard as much, their contributions kind of overlooked. A really striking example is Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. They were both transgender women of color who were key figures in the Stonewall riots.
The Stonewall riots, wow, those were huge. A turning point in the fight for LGBTQ plus rights.
Exactly. But because of that machismo in the Chicano movement, their experiences as trans women weren't really seen as central to the fight for Latinx liberation.
It's almost like they hadn't quite grasped the concept of intersectionality yet, right?
Right. And that brings up a huge question. How do we make sure today's movements learn from these mistakes? How do we avoid repeating them? Well, Ortiz talks about this really powerful idea, decoloniality.
Decoloniality. I have to admit, that sounds a bit academic. What does it actually mean in this context? How does it apply to social movements?
Well, it's about dismantling systems of power, not just external ones like racism and colonialism, but also the internalized biases that exist within movements themselves.
So you're saying it's not enough to fight for equality just on a societal level. You also have to be actively challenging those hierarchies within your own group, right?
You got it. Because those internal biases can be just as damaging, just as limiting as those external ones we're all fighting against.
So are there examples of movements that are actually doing this? That are embracing this idea of decoloniality in a concrete way?
Oh, definitely. A great example is the Black Lives Matter movement. They're very intentionally centering voices that have traditionally been excluded, including LGBTQ plus individuals.
That's encouraging to hear. So there's hope. But how do we ensure that this awareness actually leads to real change, lasting change, especially when you consider how deep-seated some of these biases are?
It's a challenge for sure. And to really understand that challenge, we need to broaden our view a bit, go beyond just race and LGBTQ plus issues. Ortiz argues that patriarchal norms have really limited the effectiveness of lots of movements throughout history.
Okay, this is getting interesting. Give me some examples. What kind of movements are we talking about here?
Well, we were just talking about the Chicano movement, right? So let's stick with labor movements for a minute. Think about the United Farm Workers. Most people associated with, well, Cesar Chavez.
Right, Cesar Chavez, yeah, the iconic leader. I remember learning about him in the Great Boycott way back in school.
Exactly. But Ortiz wants us to think about Dolores Huerta, too. She was actually a co-founder of the UFW, and she faced a real uphill battle against that same machismo we were talking about.
Dolores Huerta, yeah, I've heard that name. She was amazing, right? Instrumental in organizing workers, negotiating contracts, getting whole communities involved.
She was incredible.
Yeah.
But her contributions weren't always recognized the way Chavez's were. Ortiz points out that she was often overshadowed by him.
It's kind of sad, isn't it, that even in movements explicitly aimed at challenging power structures, those same biases manage to creep in.
It really is. And it makes you wonder, are there examples of this, like outside the U.S. too? In other movements?
Oh, I'm sure there are. Every society has its own ingrained biases, right?
That's right. Ortiz actually brings up Frantz Fanon. Did you ever read him?
Fanon. The name rings a bell. Wasn't he like a revolutionary intellectual or something?
He was really influential in anti-colonial struggles, especially in Algeria. He was a psychiatrist, actually, and wrote about the psychological effects of colonialism.
Wow, that sounds intense. Must have been groundbreaking stuff at the time.
Oh, it absolutely was. But Ortiz points out that even Fanon, in his analysis of colonialism, he didn't always fully grasp the experiences of women. You know what I mean?
Like he focused on one form of oppression, but didn't quite see how patriarchy played into it.
Yeah, exactly. It's like
Yeah.
you peel back one layer of oppression and find another one underneath.
This is giving me a lot to think about in terms of how we view historical movements. Like, it's not always as simple as good guys and bad guys, right? There are all these layers of complexity.
Right. It's about nuance, seeing the full picture.
Hmm.
Ortiz had other examples, too, that I found really thought-provoking. One that stands out is his look at the Black Panther Party.
The Black Panther Party, wow, that's not what I was expecting.
I know, right? They were such a powerful symbol of resistance, of radical change. But Ortiz highlights the experiences of women in the party, like Kathleen Cleaver and Elaine Brown. They were both very prominent, but even they faced misogyny within the organization.
That's pretty sobering. It's like no movement is immune to these deep-seated cultural norms, no matter how radical their goals.
It goes to show that dismantling these norms is an ongoing process. It takes work, constant vigilance, and a willingness to challenge even our own assumptions about the world.
Yeah.
You can't just assume that because a group is fighting for one kind of justice, they have everything else figured out.
So it's like a process of constantly learning and unlearning, huh?
Exactly. And speaking of learning, Ortiz actually goes even deeper. He examines the legacies of some really iconic figures in social justice history. Malcolm X, James Baldwin, W.E.B. Du Bois, even Martin Luther King Jr., all through this lens of intersectionality.
Okay, now that's something I definitely want to hear more about. I mean, these are people who made enormous contributions to the fight for equality. So is Ortiz saying we need to, like, view them differently now?
Not necessarily view them differently, but maybe understand them more fully. Recognize that even those who fight for justice can still be, well, products of their time. They can still hold biases, even while they're working to dismantle other forms of oppression.
Yeah, it's about acknowledging the whole picture, right? Their contributions were huge, absolutely. But it's also important to see, where they might have fallen short. It gives us a more honest and complete understanding of their legacies.
So it's not about like canceling these figures or anything like that, more about nuance.
Exactly. Nuance is key. For
Hmm.
example, Ortiz talks about how, in his early years, Malcolm X was really tied to the doctrines of the Nation of Islam.
Right, right. Which from what I remember had some pretty traditional views on gender roles, yeah.
They did. And so some of his statements from that time, well, they definitely reflect a patriarchal worldview, which was unfortunately pretty common back then.
Makes sense. Even someone as radical as Malcolm X was still shaped by the world around him. Absolutely. And with James Baldwin, who is such a brilliant voice on race and sexuality, Ortiz points out that his work often centered primarily male perspectives, which, kind of limited his ability to fully explore the experiences of Black women.
It's interesting how these limitations pop up even in the work of someone like Baldwin, who was so ahead of his time in so many ways. It makes you think about, like, what blind spots we might have today, even when we're trying to be so progressive.
That's a good point. It's definitely something to reflect on. We all have our blind spots.
Okay, so we've talked about Malcolm X and James Baldwin. What about Du Bois and Martin Luther King Jr.? How do they fit into all of this?
Well, with Du Bois, who's a towering intellect, a founder of the NAACP, Ortiz acknowledges his huge contributions to Black liberation. But he points out that Du Bois also, at times, seemed to downplay the role of Black women in the struggle. Like, he saw their role as primarily supporting men.
That's interesting. And what about Martin Luther King Jr.? I mean, he's practically a saint in the American imagination.
I know, right? But even King, Ortiz argues, could done more to elevate women's voices within the civil rights movement. He mostly surrounded himself with male advisors, and, there were definitely women doing incredible organizing work that didn't always get recognized.
Wow. So we're really seeing a pattern here, huh? It's like no matter how progressive a movement is, it seems like they've all struggled with this issue of gender equality.
It's a recurring theme, for sure,
Hmm.
and it really underscores Ortiz's point about how intertwined these different forms of oppression are, right? You can't fully address one without addressing the others. They're all connected.
Okay, so that brings us to a really big question. Where do we go from here? What can we learn from all of this? How can we build movements that are truly inclusive, that don't repeat these same mistakes?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And as you can imagine, there's no simple answer. But Ortiz does offer some valuable insights based on, this idea of decoloniality we've been discussing. Do you remember what that means?
Yeah, it's about challenging that colonial mindset that says some identities are more important than others, recognizing that those hierarchies exist everywhere, even within groups fighting for equality.
Exactly. It's about shifting how we think about power, about identity. It has to happen on a fundamental level.
But how do we actually do that? What are some concrete steps we can take? What would you say are the most important takeaways from Ortiz's work?
For me, the biggest takeaway is that we have to actively center the voices of those who have been pushed to the margins. We need to listen to women, to LGBTQ plus individuals, to people of color, to anyone who's been excluded. Really listen.
Right, so it's more than just saying we're inclusive. It's about making sure those voices are actually heard.
Exactly. It's about sharing power. Letting go of the idea that there's only one right way of doing things. And honestly, it's about being comfortable with a little bit of discomfort. Challenging our own biases, our own assumptions, well, it can be tough. It can be uncomfortable.
For sure. But growth and change, they often happen outside of our comfort zones, right?
It's so true. Yeah. And we also have to remember that no movement is going to be perfect. We're all going to make mistakes. The important thing is to be open to feedback, to be willing to change course, and to keep striving for justice and equity.
It's
Always.
like a journey, not a destination.
I love that. And that journey requires a real commitment to understanding intersectionality, seeing how all these different forms of oppression connect and overlap. We can't fight for racial justice without addressing sexism. We can't fight for LGBTQ plus rights without acknowledging the impact of colonialism. It's all part of the same fabric, the same struggle.
Wow, that's a powerful way to look at it.
It's about seeing the big picture and building solidarity. Our struggles are connected, and we're stronger when we fight together.
This whole conversation has been incredible, seriously eye-opening. I feel like I have a whole new way of thinking about social justice movements now.
That's so great to hear. And honestly, that's what a deep dive like this is all about. It's not about giving you all the answers, but about making you think and
Yeah.
starting a conversation.
Because as much as we've covered today, we've really only scratched the surface, haven't we?
We have. There's so much more to explore. So to our listeners, we encourage you, keep digging. Check out the work of Christian Ortiz. Learn more about intersectionality and decoloniality. And keep having these conversations. They're so important.
Because every voice matters, right? And together, we can build a more just and equitable world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone.